Great. Thank you very much to all four of you, to Carmen and Sherry and Pedro and Kurt. Those were wonderful presentations. Thank you guys for taking the time to put them together. I know that takes effort, and I hope the audience appreciated that. And as we saw, quite a diverse spectrum of research, and I think that's why we put this panel together. So we have a number of questions. Let me remind the audience, everyone out there, there is should be a button on your screen to submit the email, any questions, either questions for the group or questions to individual panelists that we can answer, try to answer for you. I have a number here, which I will try to curate, so I'll try to read and speak at the same time. We'll see how that goes. Let me start, though, with sort of maybe a big picture kind of question, and then we can dive deeper. This is sort of a version of the vision question, my version of it. And actually a couple of you, so Carmen just used this phrase, success begins with the end, and Pedro talked about you need to have sort of a target. We don't do nano just for the sake of doing nano. I think there's a space for discovery science and just looking for new phenomenon, but in the end, the goal is not just to say, hey, we did a bunch of nanotechnology. The goal is to use that nanotechnology to enable something. And so my question is phrased this way for each of you in whatever space you are working in. If you think ahead 10 years in that technology space, so can you describe one nanotechnology-enabled application that isn't possible today that you could envision or hope would be possible in the future? Because I think these are the kind of things that do inspire the current day R&D. Thinking about what do we want to try to accomplish in the future, using 10 years as a good number, that we can't do now, and how are we going to get there, and what kind of R&D do we need to get there? So I can call on you, or one of you can jump in. Anybody's willing? All right, I'm gonna call on someone. Kurt, you get to go first. I don't know why. I saw you on the screen first, but you're muted. I think you need to unmute.
Sure. One that I could see an application moving forward that hopefully within the next 10 years we would have are theranostic nanomaterials. So, the mRNA vaccines right now, that's a lipid nanoparticle. So it protects an antigen that's going to help the immune system develop a response to COVID-19, right? So where can you go beyond that in drug delivery with nanotechnology? And this is the idea behind Theranostics, right? Where you combine diagnostics with targeted drug delivery. So not just introducing a drug to the body and hoping some of it gets to the right place, but taking a nanoparticle and coating it, for instance, on the outside with an antigen there that will attach to a specific protein at the diseased tissue, a tumor, or whatever you're trying to get that particle to, right? So it attacks and attaches to the right place. Then you have packed inside the nanoparticle, perhaps because it's porous, right? You have your therapeutic agent. And if you can combine that with another agent that's fluorescent, or if the nanoparticle itself is fluorescent or has another response that we can detect, now what you have is a vehicle that protects your drug, delivers it to the site that the drug is needed. It doesn't just give it systemically to the whole body and you waste most of it. And also it gives you a diagnostic signal that allows you to determine whether it's gone to the right place and whether, for instance, your tumor is starting to shrink away as we'll have those nanoparticles attached to the tumor, and then we can actually visualize it. So that would be a real something that we're looking forward to over the next 10 years to developing those type of theranostic nano structured particles.
Thanks, Kurt. That helps. Actually, I'm not sure, maybe others have. I don't think I've ever heard the term theranostic, but it makes sense. I think it's the therapy and diagnostics coming together into one system, right? That's great. Thank you. Sherry, did you have a comment? I think you were starting to
Sure.
speak.
Maybe I'll share. I have the opportunity as a director of a new NSF Engineering Research Center, where in fact, since it's new, we have just about 10 years in the time scale of to address a problem. And a part of that is, in fact, and I know there's a question on, where is nano in a center that's on the Internet of Things for precision agriculture? And I'll highlight one as an example. It's not the only place where we have nano as part of the center. But what we're interested in doing and what we'd hope to be able to deliver would be to introduce sensors that operate both above and below the soil surface. And right now you can buy, for example, a sensor where you can, put it into the ground, for example, and measure water. But they're somewhere on the order of, many hundreds to $1,000 for a sensor. And the question that we want to address is not only for water, but for lots of different targets that we would like to be able to address to understand the influences of the environment on the yield and sort of health or resilience of our crops. And this would connect to Carmen's interest. We can sort of, tag team and pass it over. But what we're interested in is sensors that we can deploy that really change the paradigm of cost so that you could really introduce sensors that would operate below the ground. And so, for example, we're looking at some, small-scale versions of microelectromechanical devices. How do we collect information that's sensitive to the environment, as well as on the communication side to be able to communicate from outside of the soil? How do you get information out of the soil? And for us, that means to an infrastructure that already exists in agricultural fields. There's lots of infrastructure there, or for example, to robotics, aerial and ground-based robotics. And we think about the same thing above the soil surface, where we want to, again, be able to detect different targets of interest. All of these targets, whether above or below the soil surface, could be related to water, ions, pH, maybe one-day pathogens. How do we get and have a much more proactive response so that we're not waiting to see when the plant's not healthy, but you can sort of have preventative medicine for plants so that you can respond and take action in the field. And so we see that in all of the cases that we're thinking about, a lot of the cases really rely on the unique functions or the fabrication, the manufacturing that's possible with nanoscale materials to sort of look at, and I think Pedro and I both spoke to the idea that nanoscale materials are very sensitive to their environments and that you can use, whether it's chemical, optical, magnetic, electrical domains, to be able to design nanoscale materials that will be responsive and then give rise to a change, for example, that we can then communicate. And that's what we're looking to really deliver that requires, or will certainly look to take advantage of both the function and fabrication manufacturing that's possible with nanoscale materials.
Great, thanks, Sherry. And in fact, I just noticed there was a question that came in about whether nanoelectronic wireless sensors are important for food and agriculture. So I think you've given a pretty definitive yes answer to that one. Thank you. Carmen, do you want to follow up with anything from your perspective, particularly the agriculture perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Sherry was right on the target. I mean, I'll second everything she said. That's definitely one of the advantages of nanotechnology and the sensors that we are trying to develop for this application is the time to get the response compared to sending analytes to the lab and get information from a third party. Is to be able to collect that information in situ, in the field, where you need the most necessary information for you to make a decision in terms of, should I apply more fertilizers? Should I apply pesticides? Does it need more water? Or, for example, for animal health, maybe you can diagnose beforehand, before the whole herd is contaminated with some type of pathogen. So one of the things that it needs for nanotechnology to break into food and agriculture is the cost. Right now, sensors, as Sherry was mentioning, they are highly expensive, so it's really hard to get adopted. So can we improve the manufacturability of them? Can you make them scalable? And consequently, by doing that, you can reduce the cost and easily distribute. Can you make them last longer? So it becomes a good investment. You don't have to be replacing it from time to time. And also, if possible, making them biodegradable, or at least that doesn't contaminate the field. So if you end up using a lot of them, you don't have to worry about having to rescue them back or doing some harm to your field. So those are one of the main things. And always we have to keep in mind where we are going to apply those sensors, right? You don't design the same type of sensors for a farm that you're going to apply in a food processing facility, or that you're going to try to communicate to your consumer before eating. It's a different type of design that you have to think about, and how you make the communication clear across the different stages of production. So that would be my thoughts.
Great, thanks, Carmen. Pedro, some perspective on water?
Sure. I think that the pursuit of higher selectivity through molecular level recognition, as well as multifunctionality, is going to lead us to smarter materials that can simultaneously sense, seek, and destroy priority pollutants, even those that we cannot handle right now. And I envision also more data-driven approaches, and even what we call artificial intelligence, to accelerate discovery of materials, provided that we can have access to high-quality data, of course, and even predict their behavior and functions in complex environments. And this is going to be probably a big win in moving the needle faster towards enhancing beneficial applications in many different domains.
Thanks, Pedro. So we actually got a couple specific questions for you, Pedro, on your presentation. The first was about the lifetime of the phages on the nanoparticles, and have they been, and secondly, have they been genetically modified or not? You're muted still, Pedro.
Sorry about that. Yeah, phages are self-replicating, right? One gets into a bacteria cell and 100 come out. And as long as there are hosts that they can infect, they will keep replicating. But without them, they die off because they cannot infect other bacteria that you're not targeting, or they cannot infect protozoa or humans. So typically, it takes about a few days for them to completely disappear. So they don't have any residual disinfection concerns, as does chlorine, for example, or ozone that form carcinogenic byproducts. But let me say that we don't need to engineer them. Phages are by far the most abundant biological resource on Earth, and also the most diverse. And I would argue it's also the most underutilized resource right now. And what we do is we use nanoparticles that are super paramagnetic, and we attach bacteria to them. And we fish phages that attach to them, and using the magnetic field, we pull them out. And then we go that way, we get the phages that we need for different applications, right? So it's really easy to create a bank of phages that can attack your target. And again, safety is not a concern. If you wanted to keep them for a long time, yes, we can put them inside safe bacterial spores and keep them for years without refrigeration, and then target trigger germination. We know how to do that, but that's another story. So there's no need for genetically manipulation. There's sufficient diversity on Earth for that.
Thanks, Pedro. All right, maybe we'll shift gears here a little bit. It's a question directed at Kurt, though others may want to comment as well, about education. So it says, can you speak towards your suggestion of increasing education? Does this include broader public general awareness in education, training students and the next generation workforce, and ways to encourage companies to participate through their product education?
Absolutely. So I would really encourage companies to get involved in the education system, whether that's getting involved with local high schools and events with them, or organizations that try to get kids involved in science, and also directly involved with universities, certainly. I mean, I teach the full spectrum of physical chemistry, and I still am really amazed at how little, when students first come into my chemistry classes, physical chemistry, that, they know lasers. That's what they think, oh, that's really cool science, right? Because lasers have been put on the heads of sharks in movies, right? And so they know about lasers. They're still usually not that au fait with nanotechnology, right? So certainly getting more nanotechnology into the curriculum, making students aware of it earlier on. I don't think they really see it in high school and know how much it affects them, to get across examples of how it's affects everyday life, and how we already have some products that are certainly involved in that, But I think a broader awareness, not only for the general public. Certainly we should get people to know that we're responsibly developing nanotechnology, but I think getting it into the education process, making students aware of it and say, that's a career path for me, I want to be involved in this, and that there are all these different fields, from engineering through biology, medicine, chemistry, physics, that are involved with nanotechnology. It's really something we need to get the message out about.
So there was actually a separate, you sort of touched on it. There was a second question here that says essentially, is the public knowledge of nanotechnology actually important to acceptance and further, normalization of it? There's lots of great ideas in technology. The question was how much of an impact does general understanding or acceptance of nanotechnology affect their future of these goals? So I don't know, does anyone else want to comment just on education in general, both sort of formal education and more broadly just dissemination of knowledge?
I would say that it's really important to nurture intellectual entrepreneurship. And sometimes that requires basically instilling a sense of how to do team-based science, how to appreciate multidisciplinarity without sacrificing your core expertise, right? And to a certain extent, be aware of things like techno-economic analysis early on, so that you make sure that you are working on the correct side of the decimal point, and as well as life cycle assessment to avoid unintended consequences of your actions. So these are, in other words, I like to promote students that are T-shaped. That means that they have sufficient depth in their discipline, but that they think in systems and are aware of the implications and applications of their work beyond their immediate domain.
I agree with Pedro too. And I think it's very important, and I think NNI does already a very good job in having the public opinion involved. So people should be familiar with the word nanotechnology. It shouldn't be something that they find out only when they enter in college, because if there is a negative perspective against nanotechnology for whatever reason, it becomes really hard to break those barriers later on. It seems that the negative spreads so much faster than the positives. I don't know. So I think involvement of society as a whole, again, understanding where this technology is going to be applied to, understand the culture, how you can really show trust that this type of technology is for the benefit, for something that is going to enhance the quality of life. I think that's how you make sure that nanotechnology is here to stay, and it's something that everybody wants to be a part of it. It's something that is going to benefit for the next generation. So one of the things that we think is, for example, if you're going to use sensors for low resource places, you cannot just come in with a gizmo, right, and try to show them, oh, this is going to solve your problems. Very likely it will be rejected if you don't have a good communication with them, if you don't educate and show really what is behind this technology. So again, public involvement is very important.
Can I
Thanks, Kurt.
jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead, Kurt.
So there's a few things we can tie together here. Sensors. I would bet very few students are excited when you say sensors, right? And we've had questions about, oh, can AI or machine learning help us in developing nanotechnology further? Well, one of the things that everybody should get across from whatever you're involved in, whether it's Google searches or not, right, is that bad data in means bad answers out. Okay, whether it's a search algorithm or whether it's a machine learning algorithm or whether it's AI to try and develop new syntheses or whatnot. And how do you get good data? Well, you have to have sensors that give you good data. You know, these are the kind of things that if we get these across, why do I want to develop sensors that are so specific, that are wearable, right? And things like this. Getting those ideas across, you can see this is how nanotechnology is something that is a bridging technology that allows us to take these, you know, quantum ideas and things like this and tie it into software and other things that will generate products that will really move society forward and address those needs. But I don't think when most people hear the word sensors, what's that? That's a way of developing good data, because we need good data in to these AI or ML algorithms in order to get good answers out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Kurt. Yeah, and I think sensors is one of those also, and I was going to come to this later, but this sort of intersection of fields. I mean, sensors is so prevalent it's hard to think of a field, I think, where sensors, some kind of detection is not important, right? So I think the sensors are incredibly valuable. I also wanted to make one comment back to what Carmen was saying about societal impacts, because we got a question early on, actually on Lisa's presentation, where she mentioned briefly societal impacts, and the question we got in from the audience was whether that includes sort of both positive and negative impacts. And the answer, of course, is yes, absolutely. We want to think about, we use the word impact, and sometimes in this context, everyone thinks about the negative impacts, but in fact, the positive impacts is really, really critical. And of course, there's tomorrow, one of the breakout sessions is on responsible development. And, we have to be cognizant of the potential negative impacts of any technology. Let's not just limit it to nanotechnology, but I think, as has been said, articulating the values and the benefits, the positive impacts, is really important. Okay, there was, let's see. Oh, shoot, there's too many questions here. I'm trying to find the one I was looking for. Well, I guess sticking on education for a minute, I was, from the perspective and trying to turn our conversation now as much as we can back to, the NNI, which is a federal government initiative, right? And the question of what, as Lisa said at the beginning, the goal of this workshop is to provide input that will be used to write an updated strategic plan for that initiative. It's updated roughly every 4 years. The last one was in 2016, I believe. So we're now maybe late 2016. So thinking about education from the initiative perspective, are there things that we, that could be done differently or better, specifically around sort of the formal education in STEM, and how do we integrate nanotechnology into that? Because as I said earlier, and I think others agree, it's not, the goal is here not nanotechnology for nanotechnology's sake, but as we've seen already just in this, hour plus discussion, it touches so many different fields, scientific fields, technological fields, societal fields, et cetera. So I'm curious to hear thoughts about how we might think about evolving the STEM education system to, address some of these challenges.
So maybe I can say a couple of things. I think what is important is to develop a globally competitive workforce, and requires an innovation ecosystem with the participation also of industry, and also, teach the teachers, community college students, the whole thing. So the ERC program does that very well, I think, and that's something, a model that I would consider. But also I want to point out among the education that this is a great opportunity to use science and technology as a tool for diplomacy also, to regain international respect and leadership by doing good, using science and technology as a tool for diplomacy. And an important flag for that would be nanotechnology. I just want to leave that out there.
Thanks, Rachel.
I thought maybe I'd chime in, because there's some synergies even in the previous conversation in just thinking about the opportunity that as you look forward, in some sense, we lots of programs looked at, and we had, nano, and then there was bio and info, right? But as we look forward and we think what's next, which I think is what you're asking, right, 20 years into the NNI, I think the opportunity is to express ourselves often by the opportunities now that we can showcase some of the examples. We might all hope that there be more applications that come out, right? And I think that we have those opportunities, but there are examples that are, whether people realize it, that it's in the technology that they're using or not. So we have an opportunity to express that and to showcase through examples where many don't realize that's what it took to develop that technology. And then also now to express maybe nano-enabled technologies and systems. So starting to think about how, that it's time, what's the next step, right? And that's just not, nano for just the science, but thinking about the opportunities and use cases. And I think from an educational standpoint, I think everybody you've heard speak about is that often students are, hard to say that they should be excited and tough it out through hardcore courses in, quantum or electromagnetics or, whatever the topic is, but that if you express it and get, I also appreciate the involvement of industry, that having the problems and understanding the sort of, as Pedro mentioned, the problem-driven questions, that you can get, students are very excited about being able to make an impact on society. And at first, they may, maybe they're actually somewhat impartial about which area they were going to, work hard, but they want that opportunity to be involved. And I think that there's an opportunity now as we look to think about those impacts and the application and technology domains as a way to express and look forward to sort of deliver on the opportunities of nanoscale science.
Yes, Sherry, thanks for those comments. That's great. Actually, I was looking at, we got a comment/question early on that I'll read part of it here because I think it relates to what you're saying. Nanotechnology research is currently very prominent and spans many fields, as we've discussed, but the development of products based on the research seems relatively slow. What do you think is this? Why do you think this is the case? What steps to be taken to encourage the development and commercialization of innovative nano-based products? And I think that may be true in cases, but it may be also partially the case that it's happening and people just don't know it, like you said, right? That it's sort of this invisible technology development pathway. And this sort of gets into a little bit of what is actually this afternoon's panel discussion on the development pathway. So I don't know that we want to go too far down that road and leave that to the other panel. But I am interested in, I'm very interested in this translation from what I call nanoscience to nanotechnology, right? We talk a lot about nanotechnology, but it really all starts, in my opinion, of course I'm a scientist, it starts at nanoscience, right? And then, and the properties of materials and systems and structures at that scale. And then the challenge, real challenge, science challenge, technology challenge of translating that into, translating it either in scale, meaning I just need to do it at scale, I need to learn more of it, and or translating it into incorporating, this nano-enabled systems where the nano part is part of a larger system that enables some capability. And I'd be curious, again, as we think about, trying to this vision of the future for R&D, how do we think about investing in not just the sort of lowest level nanoscience, but how to then moving that nanoscience, maintaining those fascinating, unique properties of nanoparticles or nanosystems, and translating that up to the application space. That's something I think about, and it's unclear to me. I think that's where a lot of the opportunities lie, but it's also the challenging space.
So let me say that. As scientists, we often push an idea up to a technology readiness level of, let's say, 2. But we need a pull for it to cross the valley of death. And that pull has to come from industry, from manufacturers, and so on. And that's sometimes what we're lacking. And one instrument that really helps cross the valley of death are small startup companies. So investing more on small business innovation, grant research, SBIRs, is something that really helps. But it really will take, to a certain extent, a change in the research culture to work more, again, in teams, to form these platforms, innovation ecosystems, if you wish, that include industry early on, but you also have to educate industry so that you're not just solving the problem du jour for them, right? But that they actually encourage them to think long-term, what are the common barriers that they face that require basic research where we navigate better, and essentially couple better the push with the pull. And I think that intermediate are the small companies through small business innovation grants.
Thanks, Pedro. Anybody else have thoughts about that?
I would agree with Pedro and say that like the culture in universities and research centers, maybe it educate more the faculty about the startups and how they can get to the next level. This is still a big, I would say, barrier for most faculty to think about that their technology could be spin-off into something. I mean, I'm part of one startup company, and I'm one of the few in my department that does it. So it sounds like almost like a second degree of importance sometimes. Maybe there is more to educate the academic community that this is actually push for innovation, that actually this drives more research by doing that. So that's my.
Thanks, Carmen. Kurt, do you have comments from your perspective, maybe as as a small company member?
Pardon, to whom was that addressed?
That was to you, Kurt.
Oh, okay, yes. So, being on both sides of that. So I went to the University of Pittsburgh for my bachelor's degree and Stanford for my PhD. And I learned through all of that how to write that first paragraph of a paper that said something about really crazy, wild ideas and something we could address. It was really big, but I learned nothing about how to connect a real innovation from the lab to a commercial product, right? I didn't even know, certainly from my chemical education, what the chemical industry made, right? That was one of the things I realized much later on is, what does the industry actually do? We don't address that very much because maybe there aren't enough people just popping in from industry telling us what we're doing sometimes. There's certainly, I think, academics have gotten more in touch with commercialization, or at least being able to think about translation of ideas. That wasn't done as much, but in trying to get a startup off the ground and taking an idea from the lab to really commercialization, it's a much different thought process, and academics fall in love with their ideas, and they really want to follow that idea, and they get wed to things. And when you go to commercialization, you need to be more malleable, and you need to take ideas where they really have to follow, because it isn't about the idea, it's about the solution. It's about the problem you're trying to address. And that's a different type of problem solving. And that's some place where I think only by melding efforts of industry, and this is where NNI can certainly provide grease for the machine, right? You can't just teach innovation. You have to talk to people who do innovation. You have to talk to people who generate ideas, and you have to see how you can put those two things together, right? And a lot of places, in the basic sciences, you probably don't get that addressed enough. And that may be because we don't have enough interaction with industry.
Yeah, that's a great point. Before I came to DOE, which was now almost 13 years ago, I actually spent 7 years at a small company. So I appreciate exactly what you're saying about the different nature of what has to happen, the different decision-making processes. But I think the interface between those two is so important, and it needs to be a two-way dialogue, right? That's, I think, what you're saying, that the dialogue, it's not just do all this research and pass it up the chain. There's got to be that communication going both directions, so that the people doing research in academia or at national labs really understand the challenges being faced in a technology space that might be addressable through their research endeavors. Other comments about that. I guess I'm also, I guess to jump off of what Kurt just said about the role of the NNI, and it really is a question, sort of the big question is what can the government do, or can the federal government do better in promoting that that relationship between academia and industry? So it's sort of the three-legged stool, right? The academic, industry, government lab kind of, government/government lab. So it's the combination of government funding agencies and government lab. What's the role, how can the government, particularly the federal government, of course, for the NNI, what might it look like going forward that's different? We've done this NNI for 20 years and with lots of success in many areas, but now we're really trying to look for a vision of the future. And the future R&D might look different than R&D 20 years ago, right? And what that means. And I think evolving that relationship and the mechanisms is important. So, if any thoughts people have about what those mechanisms might be, what we might do differently, SBIR is, I think, a great example, but that's a model, and are there others? No comments, no thoughts.
No, I was going to say that.
No comment. Yeah, thank you.
Definitely, NNI can help bring us together, right? So maybe that's simple things such as organizing a forum where we can meet up and understand the needs of the industry better and drive the right questions so we can go back and start a relationship with industry. That's one way. Another way is perhaps a forum for startups to meet up and get together. I mean, ERCs do a great job on that. The industry becomes part of the decision force of the research, right? IUCRCs too. They are also more towards the industry needs than the fundamental research side of things, but IUCRCs are designed for to bridge this gap between university and industry, and the industry decides what projects should be done by the universities that are involved. So maybe NNI can be, like Kurt was saying, agrees or a connecting dot among the different sectors of industry that have interest in nanotechnology but don't know really what the potential is, and we don't know also, and the researchers can try to answer those questions.
Yep. So we've gotten a couple comments in. I guess I can read some of them to get people. So this is related to the last discussion. In terms of time of translation, I think people forget that products have to be designed by engineers, not scientists. So while scientists can develop new materials in the lab, it takes time for the properties of the new materials to make it into engineering toolkits. Any radical new material generally takes 1 to 3 decades. And I think we've all heard this before, and it's a challenge, right? This question of what is the time for really revolutionary new materials, new systems, new ideas to make that translation. And so any thoughts about how we accelerate that time frame are certainly important. But this person also goes on to say that, while grants are helpful to industry, they're really not enough to build a business, and mentions the importance of the federal government as a first customer, which is an interesting point to make. That if you have, obviously any business, if it's going to be successful, needs a customer or customers, and I think the point of the government as some of that pull, the customer pull, at least initially, is an interesting concept. We only have about 5 or 7 minutes left before we're going to take a break. And there was one other topic that actually Kurt raised to some extent, but others mentioned, and I wanted to come back to it for a little bit of discussion, which is the question of infrastructure. Because I think the infrastructure, and there's a breakout session tomorrow all about physical and cyber infrastructure for nanotechnology, but obviously the whole R&D ecosystem relies extremely heavily on the availability of infrastructure. And I think Kurt made a really interesting point, which was often when we say infrastructure, people think big. And actually there's also, as Kurt mentioned, the sort of lab scale infrastructure that is, particularly in this space, quite important. And I think that's an interesting point to think about, and how, again, thinking about the initiative, are there ways that the NNI could more effectively make infrastructure available broadly to the NNI community, stakeholders. And that, again, infrastructure broadly, so it's, it's obviously building the big equipment and making it available, but that's also how do you enable capabilities at lab scale in teaching labs, for example, coming back to the education component. So what are there thoughts on the group about how we attack this infrastructure challenge going forward?
Andy, I thought I'd start by saying that, of course, there are some things that the NNI does. I think the NNCI, the Nanoscale Coordinated Infrastructure, and I see that there's, from the comments, I can see that some of our colleagues who lead some of those facilities are on the call. I think those actually, right, do offer, it's a good model by which it, often it brings in people from, their own regions and beyond. And also it's a way that it also spans some of the conversation of how do we get people to mix academia, industry, and government. And so I think that that's actually a fairly good model in creating somewhat, they are larger facilities with smaller pieces potential, or, depending upon your size scale, but of equipment. I think that there's still an interesting opportunity for asking, how do you, I think there are number of programs that help to support what I'll call infrastructure or tooling, but some things not, to kick some things off, sometimes, individual or smaller groups of faculty would need something. And that's one where I think that it's much harder to actually come by dollars to be able to do that. And that's one where I see that there's a missing hold. The days of where there used to be, sort of equipment grants that would then spur some of these, are a little bit harder to come by. There are not none, but often it means, it's really meant for something that would go into a user facility, right, that can show the sort of broader use. But it doesn't speak to it from saying, I could really develop an application domain, and maybe it's not a big user facility. And so how do you get back to a picture where individual researchers both continue to renew their labs over time, right, so that they can tackle the next problems. And so that's one that I see as a missing hole now more than it used to be even, 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hear that from various different people, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's at that level of equipment where we are sometimes basically underserved. When we compare the research infrastructure that we have in the US to other places, say China, it's like underwhelming how far advanced they are and how ubiquitous it is for them to have very advanced equipment. We're really playing catch up here. But keep in mind that the most important issue is not the equipment, but the ideas that we generate. So I always emphasize the with students and keeping in mind that sometimes providing equipment all over the place is not the solution. And many times it just collects dust and it gets underutilized. So it has to be very well. I'm more for centralized equipment with easy access, fee for service type, than just distributing equipment all over the place.
Yeah, I think the shared equipment is a good model in many cases. It doesn't always work, but I think that an access to it is important. Kurt, you brought this topic up in your presentation. Do you have other thoughts you want to share?
One thing that often gets overlooked in the shared access equipment, which can be highly effective and very productive, is you need to have good technical staff. And for continuity, right? So if you have very large populations of graduate students, then you always have people who know how to use all of the equipment, and they're effectively used as the technical staff to keep it running. But not all schools have that, right? Not every school is in the top 25 of research funding and has a huge population of graduate students. And so a lot of places don't have enough technicians, right? Below the level of full-time faculty and above the level of graduate students and certainly undergraduate students, who keep things running for everybody. And so that's one thing that sometimes gets addressed well in the centers, but it's something that doesn't always. For instance, it drops out of MRI grants at NSF. You can't put somebody in there to keep things running. So I think that's something that can be happening, because you don't want things to get mothballed just because you have this great equipment, but then you lost continuity in who knew how to run it, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I know my role here is not to pitch my own agency, but I will point out that the DOE, and Lisa mentioned this in her introduction, and one of the videos that's available to watch is on the Nanoscale Science Research Center. So these are 5 nano facilities that were built by DOE roughly 15 years ago, 13, I think they were all completed around 2008. They sit at 5 of the DOE labs. They're open access facilities, and they have permanent full-time staff scientists dedicated to the instruments there. So one of the things we talk about is that you're not just getting access to an instrument, you're getting access to the expertise of the people who understand those instruments, know how to use them, will work with you to do your work. So I think that's a great point. It's kind of related to what Pedro was saying about the ideas. I mean, it is the whole picture, right? We need the ideas, we need the instrumentation, we need the workforce, the well-trained workforce of people. It's about putting that, and other pieces of it all together. So we're right at time. I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of seconds because I have the prerogative to do that. I want to remind people that we're going to take a half-hour break. We come back at 1:15 Eastern time for a panel discussion on the nanotechnology development pathway, and actually a number of questions that came in that I didn't get to. I apologize to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but a number of them were actually related to this commercialization question. So I encourage you to come back at 1:15 and listen to that. And I'm gonna close here. One of our attendees put in a comment that I thought was quite good, and he wrote the following: as a common theme among the 4 speakers I heard and agree with, a common theme among the 4 speakers I heard and agree with is that nanotechnology research should address grand challenges with particular emphasis on water, food, agriculture, environment. What would be other areas or grand challenges that nano can address? We heard about healthcare and theranostics. What else? So I'm not going to ask you to answer that question, but I'm going to leave you and, in fact, the whole audience with that question, because I think that's really important as we think about the future of the NNI and nanoscience and nanotechnology in general. Thinking big and thinking long-term toward the future, and then trying to come back and say, okay, what do we do now? What do we need to do now in the near term in order to enable us to actually get to those big picture grand challenges? So once again, thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Kurt, for participating. Thanks for the work you did leading up to this to prepare your remarks. I really appreciate those and your engagement in this discussion. I think it's been wonderful. Thanks to all the hundreds of attendees out there. I can't see your faces, but I appreciate your questions. And I would encourage everyone to come back in half an hour and also throughout the day tomorrow and the next for the remainder of this meeting. So thank you very much.